You probably think of motion as one of the most fundamental, undeniable aspects of our world, right?
Absolutely.
You walk, cars drive, arrows fly. It seems, well, undeniably real, something you experience every single moment.
It's baked into our experience of reality.
But imagine someone coming along centuries ago telling you that every single instance of motion you perceive is actually a grand illusion, like a logical impossibility.
It's a truly mind-bending concept, isn't it?
Yeah.
To suggest that something so intuitive, so ever-present, simply cannot exist logically.
It forces you to question the very fabric of reality, right down to the ground beneath your feet, as if your senses were playing a trick on you the whole time.
Precisely. And that kind of radical questioning is what makes early Greek philosophy so fascinating.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what we're getting into today on AI History of Western Philosophy. We're exploring the mind of one of ancient Greece's most enigmatic and profoundly influential figures, Zeno of Elea.
Zeno.
Yeah,
Not a name everyone knows, maybe, but his impact was huge.
right. Now, Zeno wasn't a philosopher known for building grand, sweeping systems of thought. He didn't construct these towering metaphysical structures of his own.
No, he was more of a deconstructor, a master of demolition, you could say.
Armed with a series of incredibly perplexing arguments known simply as paradoxes.
That's right. His fame rests almost entirely on his singular ability to dismantle the common sense of his time. To take what seemed utterly obvious like motion, like the idea that there are many different things, and show how, when you press it with rigorous logic, it leads to outright contradiction. His target are basic assumptions about how the world works.
Our mission today, then, is to explore Zeno's profound challenge to these basic assumptions about reality. Specifically, the existence of multiplicity, the idea that there are many things, and of course, motion.
We'll unpack his ingenious paradoxes, these puzzles that still make philosophers scratch their heads.
And then trace the astonishing ways they've continued to echo through centuries of philosophy, mathematics, and even, amazingly, modern physics.
It's quite a journey.
You'll discover something truly remarkable, how, in his quest to defend his teacher, Zeno pioneered a method of argument that became really the very engine of Western philosophical inquiry.
The reductio ad absurdum, reduction to absurdity.
Exactly.
Yes, this method was so impactful that Aristotle himself credited Zeno with the invention of dialectic, the art of rigorous logical debate through question and answer.
Wow. So he invented a whole way of arguing.
Essentially, yes, or at least he perfected it and showed its power in a way nobody had before. It's a testament to Zeno's unique contribution. It's a story of a brilliant failure, in a way.
How so? A failure?
Well, his explicit goal, defending his teacher Parmenides, that didn't quite land. He didn't convince it the world motion was an illusion.
Right. We still think things move.
Exactly. But the tools he created, the method, the problems he unearthed, they became monumentally successful in shaping how we think, how we argue, how we approach truth and knowledge itself.
So a brilliant failure that led to monumental success. That sets up the incredible irony of Zeno's impact perfectly. He aimed to prove motion an illusion, and largely failed at that audacious goal.
Yet, in that very failure, he gifted Western thought tools and problems that would echo for millennia.
So how did this enigmatic figure, this brilliant failure, come to wield such intellectual power? Let's really get into this.
To understand Zeno, you really need the context. You need to understand the radical philosophical landscape he was operating in.
And that means talking about his mentor, right? Parmenides?
Parmenides of Elea, founder of the Eleatic school, which Zeno belonged to. And this wasn't just another group of thinkers. It represented a seismic shift in how philosophy was done.
Before Parmenides, many ancient Greek thinkers like Thales were focused on, like, the basic stuff the world is made of.
Exactly. They were looking for the fundamental material substance of the cosmos. Was it water, air, fire? You know, the basic elements.
Right.
But Parmenides stepped back and said, essentially, hold on, everyone. Let's think about thinking itself. He argued that reason alone, pure logic, not your fallible senses, could reveal the ultimate truth about reality.
So trust logic, not what you see and hear.
Precisely. He posited two distinct paths: the way of truth, guided purely by abstract thought and logic, and the way of opinion, based entirely on our deceptive sensory experiences. He believed our senses constantly fool us.
So Parmenides wasn't just doubting our senses, he was arguing they actively deceive us about things like motion and multiplicity. That seems like a massive leap to make purely from logic. How does he even get to such a counterintuitive conclusion?
It is a massive leap, and that's the audacity of his argument. It's quite profound, actually. He starts from the absolute bedrock of what being means. What does it mean to be?
Okay.
Following this way of truth, Parmenides arrived at a conclusion that was, frankly, revolutionary and profoundly counterintuitive. What is? Reality itself must be a single, unchanging, motionless unity. He called this the One.
A single unchanging thing, so everything else is.
An illusion. This means that the entire world of change, motion, and multiplicity, everything you perceive through your senses as moving and diverse, is, in fact, nothing but a grand illusion generated by relying on those untrustworthy senses.
So if you think you see a bird flying or a river flowing, your mind is just playing tricks on you. It's like reality is a single, perfectly still photograph, and any movement you think you see is simply a projection of your flawed perception.
That's a very helpful analogy. And this wasn't just a quirky idea. It was a profound logical deduction for Parmenides. His core argument was basically this. What is cannot possibly come into being from non-being, from nothing.
Right. Something can't come from absolutely nothing.
Because if it did, that nothing would have to somehow be something for it to come from, which is a contradiction. And similarly, what is cannot pass into non-being, because then it would simply cease to exist, implying it was never truly being in the permanent sense to begin with.
Because if it can cease to exist, it's not truly existent, it's impermanent. So the logic, for Parmenides, is inescapable. If something truly is, it must always have been and always will be. It's a very different understanding of existence than we typically have.
Exactly. Therefore, he reasoned what is must be eternal. It cannot be created or destroyed. And crucially, it must be indivisible, because any division would imply non-being or emptiness between its parts, which he rejected.
Okay, eternal, indestructible, indivisible.
And if it's indivisible and eternal, it must also be motionless and unchanging. Any change would imply a transition from one state of being to another, implying something was not and then was, which Parmenides' core logic utterly rejected. So for Parmenides' reality, the true what is this static, unchanging, homogeneous one.
Wow. Okay, you can definitely see why that would be met with, well, ridicule. People look around, see a world full of movement and many different things and thought, this guy's logic must be wrong somewhere.
Unsurprisingly, yes. The common sense view is completely opposed to this.
And this, right here, is where Zeno steps onto the stage. He wasn't just a student. He was the loyal defender, the philosophical bodyguard for his mentor.
Absolutely. But Zeno didn't try to prove Parmenides right directly. And this is a really key point to grasp about his method. He didn't offer new positive arguments for this one.
So what did he do?
Instead, he forged a new intellectual weapon, one that would completely revolutionize how philosophical arguments were constructed. His method was to turn his opponent's logic against them. He would assume their common sense beliefs. Okay, let's assume there are many things. Let's assume motion is real.
Take their starting point.
Exactly. And then he would rigorously demonstrate that these beliefs, when logically followed to their own conclusions, led to consequences even more absurd and contradictory than anything Parmenides had proposed.
That's a brilliant strategy. He's essentially saying, oh, you think my teacher's ideas are ridiculous? Well, let me show you how your own common sense breaks down even faster under scrutiny. This reductio ad absurdum, this reduction to absurdity, is truly fascinating. How did this method become so foundational?
Because it's incredibly powerful. This methodological innovation was so effective, so revolutionary, that Aristotle famously credited Zeno with the invention of dialectic.
The invention of dialectic, that's huge.
Think about that. He didn't invent a philosophical system, maybe, but he created the very method of rigorous, logical debate through question and answer, through revealing contradictions that would shape all future philosophical inquiry in the West. It's about testing the logical coherence of any proposition by exploring its implications and see if they lead to absurdity.
It's a way of stress testing ideas.
Precisely. And what's fascinating here is that paradox of Zeno himself. His explicit goal defending Parmenidean monism and proving that reality was static was, by most measures, a failure.
Right. The world wasn't suddenly convinced that reality was a static, undifferentiated whole. We still saw things moving, many things existing.
We did. Yet the logical tools he created for this defense and the deep problems he unearthed in the process, problems about infinity, about the continuum, about divisibility, became monumentally important. They compelled thinkers for millennia to grapple with his challenges.
So he essentially forced thinkers to confront the logical holes he exposed in their own assumptions, even if they didn't accept his ultimate conclusion.
Exactly. He didn't succeed in his stated conclusion, maybe, but he revolutionized the way we approach and think about problems, setting a new standard for conceptual rigor. His contribution was methodological, not doctrinal, and that makes it incredibly enduring.
It's a remarkable legacy, isn't it? Creating problems so profound that they couldn't be dismissed, even if his ultimate aim wasn't achieved. While his ideas lived on, what do we actually know about the man himself? You mentioned reconstructing his life as like a paradox.
It truly is. We're piecing together fragments, often from centuries later. What we do know suggests a person of, well, fierce loyalty and a certain intellectual combativeness, traits that seem to define both his philosophical work and, interestingly, his political life.
Okay, so where was he from?
Zeno was born around 490 BCE in Elea, which was a Greek colony located in southern Italy, part of what was called Magna Graecia back then.
And his birth date is mostly inferred, right? From Plato.
Correct. It comes from Plato's dialogue Parmenides, where Zeno is depicted as nearly 40 when Socrates, who we know was born around 469 BCE, was a young man. His death is usually placed around 430 BCE.
And Elea itself, it was an intellectual hub.
It was a vibrant intellectual center, yes, and it stood apart from some earlier philosophical traditions like the Ionian thinkers Thales and Anaximander, folks like that.
Who were focused on the material stuff, as you said.
Right. The Eleatic school, founded by Parmenides, shifted gears dramatically. They pivoted towards a more abstract, rigorously logical form of metaphysics, really prioritizing reason over the evidence of the senses.
So it was less about what is the world made of, and more about how can we truly know anything about the world, and what are the logical implications of that knowledge.
Exactly. And within that school, Zeno was Parmenides' foremost student. Accounts suggest he was also a close friend, and certainly his staunchest philosophical champion. Their bond was evidently profound.
Plato even hints at something more.
Plato's account in the Parmenides dialogue hints at a pederastic relationship, which, well, regardless of its factual basis in this specific case, was a known dynamic in some master-disciple relationships at the time. It certainly emphasizes the exceptional closeness and the deep loyalty that seems to have animated Zeno's entire philosophical project. His work was, in essence, an extension of his loyalty to Parmenides.
Now, you mentioned this famed pugnacity earlier. It seems it wasn't just reserved for philosophical debates. Zeno might have been a man of action in the political arena, too.
The stories certainly paint him that way. Accounts, primarily from Diogenes Laertius, who wrote much later in the 3rd century CE, describe his involvement in a political plot.
A plot. Against who?
To overthrow a tyrant of Elea, identified as either Nereus or Diomedon. According to these stories, the plot was discovered and Zeno was captured.
And tortured. The stories sound quite dramatic. I've read about him biting off a tyrant's ear. How much of this heroic fortitude do we actually believe, given how little we know for sure?
You're right to be skeptical. The stories are certainly dramatic, likely embellished, as was common in ancient biographical accounts aiming to build heroic figures. They say he was tortured to reveal the names of his co-conspirators.
Did he break?
The legends say he endured it bravely. One version has him biting off the tyrant's ear in defiance. Another, perhaps more cunningly, says he pretended to whisper secrets, then named the tyrant's own friends as conspirators, sowing discord.
Huh. That's clever, if true. But how do you reconcile these two images of Zeno? On one hand, you have the cold, abstract logician of the paradoxes, a mind focused on pure, disembodied reason, meticulously attacking concepts with relentless, impersonal logic. And on the other, you have this passionate, heroic political martyr, a man of intense loyalty and physical courage. They almost seem like two different people.
It's a fascinating tension, isn't it? And it really highlights the challenge of reconstructing ancient lives from limited, often biased sources. While the historical truth of these specific heroic deeds is questionable, they might represent a later attempt to craft a more human personality for a philosopher whose work is so defined by its abstractness.
So the stories might serve a purpose?
Possibly. The paradoxes are impersonal logical puzzles. These anecdotes, by contrast, provide a human motivation loyalty to comrades, defiance against tyranny that neatly mirrors the intellectual loyalty he showed to Parmenides. In this light, his pugnacity, his combativeness, becomes a kind of unifying thread. It links the political revolutionary who allegedly died resisting a tyrant to the philosophical iconoclast who sought to overthrow the tyranny of common sense itself.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It provides a consistency to his character, even if the details are legendary. And speaking of his intellectual life, it's such a tragedy that Zeno's own writings are lost to us.
It is a profound loss for understanding him directly.
Imagine trying to understand, say, Einstein's work only through summaries and critiques written by his rivals.
It's a very apt comparison. Zeno is believed to have authored only one book, a treatise composed probably in his youth, which contained his collection of paradoxes. Plato mentions it was circulated and published, possibly without Zeno's full permission or intent.
And not a single fragment survives.
Not directly attributed to him, no. Our knowledge of his arguments is filtered entirely through the works of later authors who summarized, paraphrased, or critiqued them, often critically.
So we're relying entirely on secondhand accounts, often from his philosophical opponents, most notably Plato, Aristotle, and then much later the 6th century CE commentator Simplicius of Cilicia.
That's right. This complete reliance on secondary sources presents a significant historical challenge for scholars trying to reconstruct Zeno's thought accurately and fully. You always wonder what nuances, what specific phrasings, what other arguments might have been lost or distorted.
Definitely. But what we do have, even filtered, is still incredibly potent, powerful enough to spark millennia of debate.
Undeniably.
Okay, so before we dive into his most famous paradoxes, the ones about motion, it's crucial to understand that Zeno's foundational arguments actually attacked something even more basic, the very idea of many things, plurality itself.
That's a key point often overlooked. The paradoxes of motion are the most celebrated, sure, but the logical foundation of Zeno's project, his defense of Parmenides 1, lies in his arguments against plurality.
Why start there?
Because if you could show that the idea of a world composed of many distinct, divisible objects is inherently incoherent, then motion becomes impossible, almost by default. Motion requires distinct points or entities to move between, or distinct parts of an object to be in different places. If there aren't truly many things, then there's nothing for anything to move from or to. He's laying the groundwork for his assault on motion.
Ah, I see. Attack the stage before you attack the actors moving on it.
A good way to put it. So let's start with what's often called the argument from large and small, also known as the dilemma of divisibility. This is one of the best preserved paradoxes, coming to us mainly via Simplicius.
Oh, a dilemma. So 2 options, both bad.
Exactly. It's designed to reveal contradictions inherent in the very concept of divisibility. Zeno starts by assuming, as his pluralist opponents do, that there are many things in the world. Okay, fine. Now take any one of these things. If it exists, it must be a composite entity, right? Meaning it's divisible into parts.
Seems reasonable. Things have parts.
But then the dilemma arises when we consider the nature of these ultimate parts. What are they like when you divide down as far as possible?
Okay, horn 1. What if the ultimate parts, the smallest pieces you can divide something into, still have some size, even incredibly tiny size?
Right. If these ultimate parts have any size or magnitude, however small, then the whole object must be composed of them. But anything with size, by Zeno's logic, and maybe common sense then, must also be divisible. You can always cut something with size in half.
So it leads to infinite divisibility.
It seems to. This means each part is divisible into further parts, which are themselves divisible and so on, ad infinitum. Now, Zeno's opponents, especially materialists, believe that what exists must have size. So if any object is composed of an infinite number of parts, and each of those parts possesses some non-zero magnitude, then Zeno concludes that the sum of an infinite number of non-zero magnitudes must be an infinite magnitude.
Therefore, every object ends up being infinitely large.
That's the conclusion of the first horn. Every single thing is infinitely large.
Wow. Okay, that's absurd. If I take a piece of string and say, okay, this string has a finite length, but then I cut it in half, and those halves still have length, and I cut those in half, and those still have length, if I can do that infinitely, and each tiny piece still has some length, however small, then adding up all those infinitely many tiny lengths means the original string must have been infinitely long to begin with.
Precisely. It directly challenges our intuition about how finite objects can be composed of parts. It seems to blow up the very notion of finite size. But Zeno doesn't stop there. He presents the other horn of the dilemma, horn 2.
Okay, what's the alternative? What if division does eventually stop at ultimate indivisible parts? Like atoms, maybe?
Right, let's assume division stops at some point, at truly indivisible parts. Okay, so these parts are truly indivisible. What does that imply about their size?
Well, if they can't be divided, they can't have any extent, right? If they had any size, you can imagine cutting them, so they must have zero size.
Precisely. If they are truly indivisible, they cannot have any size, because anything with size is, by definition, potentially divisible. So these ultimate constituents must have zero size. Points, essentially.
Okay, zero size points.
But then Zeno asks, how can these zero-size points combine to form a whole that does have size? How can you build something with length or volume out of components that have no length or volume.
Yeah, adding 0 to 0 even infinitely many times, you still get 0.
Exactly. The addition of any number of sizeless parts, even an infinite number, can only result in a sizeless whole. As Zeno himself argued, according to Simplicius, adding something with no size to another thing does not increase its size, and subtracting it does not decrease its size. Such a thing is clearly nothing.
So it's like trying to build a wall out of invisible, weightless specks of dust. No matter how many you add, the wall would still be invisible and weightless. You can't get something from nothing.
Which leads to the second absurdity.
This means the initial assumption that there are many things and they are divisible leads to a stark contradiction. Every existing object must be simultaneously infinitely large and sizeless. Both conclusions are absurd.
He's really twisting your mind into a pretzel here, isn't he? He's taking the opponent's common sense starting point. Things exist, they have parts, and showing it leads to logical incoherence.
Absolutely devastating. And he had another one against plurality, the argument from limited and unlimited.
Yes, also preserved by Simplicius. This one targets the number of things in the universe rather than the size of individual things.
Okay, how does this one work? It uses a similar logic of contradiction, I assume.
It does. It starts with a seemingly reasonable premise. If there are many things in the world, then their number must be finite and limited. You should, in principle, be able to count them, right? There are exactly this many things, no more and no less.
Seems plausible, a definite number.
Okay. But then Zeno argues, premise 2, if there are many things, they must be separate from each other. To be distinct means to be separate. And if they are separate, then between any two distinct things, there must be another thing separating them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be separate. They'd be touching or part of the same thing.
Okay, so if you have A and B, there must be a C between them to keep them apart.
That seems to be the idea. And then, of course, between A and C, there must be a D separating them. And between C and B, an E, and between A and D.
Oh, boy. It goes on forever, doesn't it? Ad infinitum.
Exactly. This leads to the conclusion that, therefore, the number of things must be infinite and unlimited. You can always find another thing between any two things.
So here's the contradiction. The universe must be both limited in number, premise 1, and unlimited in number, conclusion from premise 2, simultaneously.
Which is impossible.
Yeah.
Once again, the initial assumption that there are many things leads to a logical contradiction, undermining the very idea of plurality.
These arguments against plurality reveal Zeno's incredible depth. He wasn't just creating clever brain teasers. He was conducting what amounts to the first rigorous philosophical investigation into the nature of the continuum, the nature of infinity, how parts relate to wholes.
Absolutely. These problems, how a finite whole can be composed of an infinity of parts, how a magnitude-like length can be built from points with no magnitude, the very concept of infinite sets. These would drive the development of mathematics and philosophy for the next 2 millennia.
And you mentioned modern scholarship suggests he might have been specifically targeting the Pythagoreans.
Yes. There's a strong suggestion, based on the nature of these arguments, that Zeno might have had the Pythagoreans in his sights. They believed reality was fundamentally composed of discrete units, identified with numbers. Zeno's plurality paradoxes directly challenged the coherence of such a world, built from countable, discrete units, asking difficult questions about the size and countability of those very units.
Which makes his attack even more precise and devastating for his contemporaries. Okay, so Zeno first attacked the very idea of many things, setting the stage for his assault on motion. Now, let's dive into the arguments he's truly renowned for, his motionless marvels. The paradoxes designed to stop motion itself in its tracks.
These are definitely his greatest hits. Preserved primarily through Aristotle's critiques into physics, they were explicitly designed to show that motion, which is a direct contradiction to Parmenides' static reality, is logically impossible.
And he had a strategy here too, right? Attacking both main ways of thinking about space and time.
That's right. Zeno didn't just present disconnected puzzles. He constructed a comprehensive assault. He created a dilemma targeting the underlying structure of reality. The first 2 paradoxes we'll discuss, the Dichotomy and Achilles, attack the idea of motion happening in a continuous, infinitely divisible space. Think smooth space and time.
Okay.
The latter 2, the arrow and the stadium, attack motion happening in a discrete, atomic space-time. Think space and time made of tiny, indivisible chunks.
So he covers both bases.
By seemingly showing motion is impossible under either conception, he tried to cut off all possible avenues to escape. The conclusion that motion must be an illusion. A very clever pincer movement.
That's a brilliant strategy. Hit them from both sides, leaving no room for escape. Let's start with the dichotomy, which is sometimes called the racetrack paradox.
Right. This one argues that to travel any given distance, say across a racetrack, an object must first traverse half of that distance.
Okay, makes sense.
But before it can traverse the half, it must traverse half of that, half a quarter of the total distance. And before that, an eighth, and before that, a 16th, and so on, ad infinitum. This creates an infinite sequence of tasks that must be completed.
An infinite number of points you have to reach before you can reach the end.
Exactly. There are two ways to look at this. There's the progressive form. To reach the end of the racetrack, a runner must complete an infinite number of sub-journeys. First to the halfway point, then to the three-quarters point, then to the 7/8 point, and so on. Since completing an infinite number of distinct tasks seems impossible in a finite time, the runner can never logically reach the goal.
Okay, so you're always getting closer, but never actually arriving, because there's always another halfway point to cross first. It makes you wonder how we ever get out of bed in the morning, let alone run a race. It almost feels like Zeno is trolling us with pure logic.
It definitely feels that way sometimes. And then there's the regressive form, which is perhaps even more unsettling.
How does that one work?
It argues that to even begin moving, to start the race at all, the runner must first reach the halfway point. But to do that, they must first reach the quarter-way point, and before that, the eighth-way point, and so on. The argument regresses infinitely toward the starting line.
So, you can never make the first move.
That's the implication. No first move can ever be made, because there's always a smaller distance you have to cover first. Therefore, motion can never even begin.
Wow, that hits right at the beginning of motion. Both forms directly target the assumption that space and time are continuous and infinitely divisible. They imply that every single step you try to take involves completing an infinite number of sub-steps, either to start or to finish.
It's a truly mind-bending problem for anyone believing in continuous motion. And Zeno then offered Achilles and the tortoise, arguably the most famous of all his paradoxes.
Yes, the classic race.
It's essentially a more dramatic and engaging variation of the dichotomy, making the same core point, but with a vivid narrative that really captures the imagination.
So set it up for us. Swift Achilles versus the slow tortoise.
Right. You imagine the swift hero Achilles racing a slow tortoise, but the tortoise gets a head start. The argument goes that Achilles can never logically overtake the tortoise.
Never, even though he's much faster.
Logically, Zeno argues never. Here's why. To overtake the tortoise, Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise started. Let's call that point P1.
Okay, he runs to P1.
But in the time it takes Achilles to reach P1, the tortoise, slow as it is, will have moved a little further ahead to a new point, P2.
Right, the tortoise isn't standing still.
So now Achilles must run to that new point, P2. But again, in the time that takes, the tortoise will have advanced yet again to P3.
And this just keeps going.
This process repeats indefinitely. At every stage, Achilles reaches the precise spot where the tortoise was. But in that interval, the tortoise has already moved on a little bit further. Achilles gets infinitely closer, the gap shrinks and shrinks, but logically, he can never actually close that final infinitesimal gap to overtake the tortoise.
Fascinating. So he's always playing catch-up to a constantly moving target, and that catch-up involves covering an infinite number of diminishing distances, just like the dichotomy.
Exactly. Aristotle, when he analyzed these, correctly noted that this paradox relies on the same core problem as the dichotomy. The difficulty of completing an infinite series of tasks or traversing an infinite series of divisions. It's the same logical mechanism, just applied in a more vivid, compelling story.
Okay, so those two attack motion in continuous space. Now, the arrow paradox shifts gears, right? This one moves away from the idea of continuous space-time and focuses on a discrete view, one composed of individual instants of time.
Yes, exactly. This paradox asks us to consider a flying arrow at any single durationless instant of its flight. Zeno argues that at any such instant, the arrow is actually at rest.
At rest, but it's flying through the air.
Zeno's reasoning is this. At any given instant, the arrow occupies a portion of space exactly equal to its own length. It fills that space and only that space. But to be in one specific place, occupying a space exactly equal to your own dimensions, isn't that the definition of being at rest? If the arrow were truly moving within that single durationless instant, it would have to somehow be in one place and also not in that place at the same time, because it would be moving to the next place, which is a logical contradiction.
So at the snapshot instant, it just is where it is. It's not going anywhere within that instant.
Precisely. It occupies a single, fixed position. And since time, in this view, is just composed of a series of such instants, and the arrow is at rest in every single one of them, it logically follows that the arrow is never in motion at all. It's always at rest.
It's like saying a movie is just a series of still pictures. If each individual picture is static, how can the whole film portray motion? Where does the motion come from if it's not in the individual frames?
That's precisely the intuition Zeno taps into. He's attacking a cinematic or quantized view of reality, where motion is supposedly constructed from a sequence of static frames or instants. He's saying that if you analyze any single snapshot, there's no motion within that snapshot. Summing up zero motion infinitely many times still gives you zero motion.
That's deeply counterintuitive again. Okay, and for his final assault against motion, Zeno presented the stadium, or the moving rods. This one is often considered the trickiest, maybe the most obscure.
It is a bit harder to grasp, and interpretations vary, but it also attacks a discrete atomic model of space and time. It relies on relative motion.
Okay, let's try to visualize it. Aristotle describes it. Imagine 3 rows and bodies, or let's say blocks, all of equal size, lined up parallel to each other on a tracks.
Right. Let's call them row A, row B, and row C. Row A is stationary in the middle. Row B starts at one end, level with A, and moves to the right at a certain speed. Row C starts at the other end, level with A, and moves to the left at the same speed as row B.
Okay, so A is still, B moves right, C moves left, same speed. They pass each other.
Now, consider the moment when they're all aligned. Then they move one unit of time or space. Zeno argued, according to Aristotle's interpretation, that in the time it takes a specific block in row B to pass one block from the stationary row A, that same block from row B will have passed 2 blocks from row C because C is moving towards it at the same speed.
Okay, yeah, relative speed is doubled. That makes sense. So what's the paradox?
The contradiction, as Aristotle interprets Zeno, arises if you assume space and time are made of indivisible minimal units, like atoms of space and instants of time. If the block in B moves past one indivisible unit of A in one indivisible instant of time, but passes 2 indivisible units of C in that same indivisible instant.
Wait, how can it pass 2 indivisible units in one indivisible instant? Doesn't that mean the indivisible instant must actually be divisible into 2 smaller instants?
Exactly. It implies that the fundamental indivisible unit of time is somehow equal to half of itself, or that the indivisible unit of space is divisible. It leads to the conclusion that double the time is equal to half the time, which is a stark contradiction.
So he's showing that if space and time are made of these indivisible minimum units, then the simple concept of relative motion leads to absurdities where these indivisible units must themselves be divisible. That makes the entire discrete framework inconsistent.
That's the essence of the argument. It aims to show that an atomic structure of space-time cannot coherently account for relative motion without generating contradictions about the indivisibility of its fundamental units.
This systematic approach truly reveals Zeno's brilliance. He's not just presenting disconnected puzzles, he's constructing this comprehensive assault. By building arguments against both the continuous model with Dichotomy and Achilles and the discrete model with arrow and stadium of spacetime,
Zeno attempted to prove that any conceptual framework that allows for motion is logically incoherent, leaving Parmenides' static, unchanging monism as the only rational alternative left standing.
he was trying to corner his opponents, leaving them absolutely no logical room to maneuver and no escape from Parmenides' conclusion that motion is just an illusion.
A truly ambitious philosophical project.
And while he didn't necessarily convert the world to Parmenidean monism, his paradoxes certainly caught the attention of the philosophical giants who came after him. They couldn't just ignore these problems.
No, they couldn't. The first and most consequential responses to Zeno's paradoxes came from Plato and Aristotle. Their critiques and engagements were immensely influential, shaping the discussion for literally millennia.
Let's start with Plato. How did he tackle Zeno?
Plato engages with Zeno most directly in his dialogue Parmenides, which is fascinating because, in addition to being a primary source for Zeno's motivations and maybe his character, it also presents a philosophical response to his arguments put into the mouth of a young Socrates.
Socrates takes on Zeno.
In the dialogue, yes. Young Socrates listens to Zeno presenting one of his arguments against plurality specifically, the argument that if things are many, they must be both like and unlike, which is impossible, because likeness and unlikeness are opposites.
And how did Socrates, or rather Plato through Socrates, try to resolve this? Did he find a flaw in Zeno's logic directly?
Not exactly. Young Socrates in the dialogue doesn't directly challenge the logical steps of Zeno's argument. Instead, he takes a different route. He introduces his groundbreaking theory of forms.
Ah, the forms. Plato's big idea.
Right, he proposes that there exists a perfect, unchanging form of likeness itself and a separate, perfect form of unlikeness itself existing in a higher, intelligible realm. A particular concrete object in our world, like a person, or maybe you and me, can then partake in both these opposite forms simultaneously without generating a contradiction.
How does that work?
For example, you can be like me in being human, but unlike me in, say, height or hair color. The object itself partakes of both likeness in some respect and unlikeness in another respect. The contradiction would only arise, Socrates argues, if the abstract form of likeness itself were unlike, or the form of unlikeness itself were like, which he deems impossible. The forms themselves don't mix with their opposites.
So Plato essentially sidesteps the paradox at the level of concrete objects by appealing to a higher level of reality, the realm of forms, where such contradictions don't apply to the forms themselves.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's less a direct refutation of Zeno's logical puzzle about concrete things and more of a co-option of Zeno's problem. Plato uses the puzzle to motivate the need for his own dualistic metaphysics, suggesting that these paradoxes arise from confusion about the relationship between the sensible world and the world of forms.
So he uses Zeno's challenge as a springboard for his own system, which in itself demonstrates the intellectual power and provocation of Zeno's puzzles, right?
Absolutely. It shows Zeno's impact, even when his ideas were reinterpreted or used to serve a different philosophical agenda. But it was really Aristotle who provided the most detailed, systematic, and for a long time, definitive ancient critique of Zeno.
Right. Aristotle dedicates significant portions of his physics to analyzing and attempting to refute the paradoxes of motion.
He did, and his engagement wasn't just historical. It was absolutely crucial for developing his own core physical and metaphysical concepts. Zeno's paradoxes effectively acted as a crucial stress test that forced Aristotle to articulate and defend the foundational principles of his philosophy of nature principles about continuity, infinity, time, and change.
So how did Aristotle tackle the dichotomy and Achilles, the ones based on infinite division?
This is where Aristotle introduced his seminal and hugely influential distinction between potential infinity and actual infinity.
Potential versus actual infinity. What's the difference?
Aristotle argued that a finite distance, like the length of a racetrack or a line segment, is only potentially divisible an infinite number of times. You can keep dividing it in theory forever. But, he claimed, it doesn't actually consist of an infinite number of already existing distinct parts that have to be traversed one by one.
So a runner doesn't have to complete an actual infinite series of physical tasks. The divisions Zeno talks about are just theoretical possibilities, not actual obstacles laid out on the track.
Precisely. For Aristotle, the runner traverses a single, actual finite distance in a finite time. The infinite divisions Zeno speaks of are conceptual, a mathematical possibility, not a set of physical tasks that must be completed sequentially. Infinity exists only potentially in the possibility of continued division or addition, not as a completed existing set.
That distinction, potential versus actual infinity, became the standard way to resolve these paradoxes for nearly 2,000 years, right?
It absolutely did. It was a powerful conceptual tool that seemed to allow for motion in a continuous world without falling into Zeno's trap. It basically said Zeno was confusing a potential infinity of points with an actual infinity of tasks.
That's a profound reframing of the problem.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the arrow paradox? The one where Zeno argued the arrow is always at rest at every single instant. How did Aristotle handle that?
Against the arrow, Aristotle attacked its core premise directly and forcefully. He asserted that Zeno's reasoning is fallacious because, in his view, time is not composed of indivisible nows, just as no other magnitude like a line is composed of indivisible points.
So time isn't made of instants, just like a line isn't made of points.
For Aristotle, yes. He saw time and motion as continuous. Motion for him is not a property of an object at a single durationless instant, but fundamentally a process that occurs over a temporal interval. You can't isolate motion within a single instant because instants have no duration for motion to happen in.
So asking if an object is moving at an instant is fundamentally the wrong kind of question, like asking the color of a sound.
Exactly. Aristotle considered it a category mistake. Motion requires an interval, however small, not a durationless point. Asking if the arrow is moving at an instant is nonsensical within his framework.
Okay, that makes sense within his system. And what about the stadium paradox, the moving rows? Was he impressed by that one?
Aristotle was far less patient with the stadium paradox. He essentially dismissed it rather quickly as a simple and egregious fallacy based on, in his view, a failure to properly understand relative motion.
So, just a mistake.
He argued Zeno incorrectly assumed that the time it takes for an object, like a block in row B, to pass a stationary body in row A must be the same as the time it takes to pass a body moving towards it in row C. Aristotle basically said Zeno was ignoring the fact that the relative speed is different in the two cases, and that invalidates the conclusion about time units being equal to half themselves.
So he saw that one as a straightforward logical error, not a deep paradox revealing issues with discrete spacetime. It's incredible how a set of puzzles from ancient Greece could force such fundamental developments in philosophical thought from giants like Plato and Aristotle.
Indeed. And whether Aristotle's refutations were entirely successful or fully captured, Zeno's original intent is still debated by scholars today. Some think Zeno might have had better arguments than Aristotle gave him credit for, especially regarding the stadium. But what's undeniable is that Aristotle's serious engagement with Zeno's challenges forced him to develop and refine the very conceptual tools like potential versus actual infinity, his theory of the continuum, his analysis of time and motion that became central pillars of Aristotelian physics and metaphysics for centuries.
Zeno acted as a catalyst, provoking Aristotle into deeper, more systematic thought.
Precisely.
Okay, so for centuries, Aristotle's ideas, especially the potential sex-sexual infinity distinction, largely reigned supreme as the answer to Zeno. People felt the paradoxes were, if not trivial, at least resolved.
That was the dominant view for a very long time.
However, the scientific revolution and, more importantly, later developments in mathematics provided powerful new frameworks that didn't just critique Zeno's paradoxes from within the old system, but seemed to definitively resolve them by fundamentally redefining the core concepts involved: infinity, space, and time.
This was a complete paradigm shift. Zeno's problems were so profound that they remained, in a sense, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the very foundations of mathematics to be rebuilt before they could be fully addressed in a new way.
And the most significant breakthrough came with the development of calculus, right?
Calculus, yes. Developed initially by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in the 17th century, and then put on a fully rigorous logical foundation by mathematicians like Augustin Louis Cauchy and Carl Weierstrass in the 19th century, calculus offered a completely new way to think about infinity and limits.
How did it tackle Zeno's Dichotomy and Achilles, the infinite tasks argument?
Zeno's argument there hinges on the intuitive but ultimately flawed assumption that performing an infinite number of tasks must take an infinite amount of time. Calculus directly challenges this with the concept of a convergent infinite series.
Convergent series?
Yeah.
You mean like adding 12 plus 14 plus 18 plus 116 and so on?
Exactly that kind of series. Calculus demonstrates mathematically that an infinite series of numbers can sum up to a specific finite value, provided the terms decrease sufficiently quickly, like in your example where the sum approaches 1.
So the math shows you can complete an infinite process in a finite time if the steps get infinitely smaller, infinitely faster.
That's the key insight. The distances Achilles must cover to catch the tortoise.
Yeah.
First the initial gap, then the smaller gap the tortoise moved, then the even smaller gap, etc., form just such a convergent series. While there are infinitely many terms, distances to cover, their sum converges to a finite total distance.
And the time taken also forms a convergent series.
Yes, the time taken for each step also decreases, forming another convergent series that sums to a finite total time. The mathematical concept of a limit formalizes precisely how this finite sum, total distance or total time, is reached through an infinite process. It effectively dissolves the apparent logical contradiction Zeno highlighted.
That's a really powerful mathematical resolution. It doesn't deny the infinite steps, but shows they can be completed.
Exactly. It provides a coherent mathematical model for how that happens.
And then came an even more fundamental revolution in understanding infinity itself, right? In the late 19th century with Georg Cantor's development of set theory.
Cantor's work was absolutely groundbreaking. It completely transformed our mathematical understanding of infinity, directly challenging Aristotle's long-held prohibition against treating infinity as an actual completed thing.
So Cantor brought back actual infinity.
He did, and he did it rigorously. What Cantor showed, stunningly, is that there are different sizes of infinity. He developed a way to compare infinite sets and prove that some infinite sets are literally larger than others.
Wait, different sizes of infinity? How does that even work?
He quantified these different sizes with what he called transfinite numbers. For instance, he demonstrated that the set of all points on a line segment represents a larger infinity, an uncountable infinity, than the set of all whole numbers, which is a countable infinity. You simply cannot list out all the points on a line, even with infinite time, whereas you can conceptually list the integers 1, 2, 3.
That's mind-blowing. Infinity isn't just one concept. There are infinities of different sizes. How did this help with Zeno's paradoxes, especially the ones about plurality, like how a line segment can be made of points with no size?
Cantor's set theory laid the foundation for later developments, particularly measure theory, which provided a definitive mathematical answer to Zeno's puzzle of how a line with finite length, a positive measure, could be built from dimensionless points, each with zero length or measure.
How does measure theory solve that?
Measure theory gives us a rigorous way to measure the size of sets of points, including infinite sets. It shows how a collection of infinitely many zero-length points, specifically an uncountably infinite number of them, like the points on a line, can indeed sum up, in a specific mathematical sense, to a finite non-zero length. It provides a consistent framework where the finite measure length of the whole interval is compatible with the fact that it's composed of an uncountable infinity of points, each having zero measure.
So the math evolved to the point where it could handle these seeming contradictions about points and lines, size and number in a completely rigorous way.
Yes, calculus and set theory provided the formal language and concepts to deal with the actual infinities and continuous magnitudes that Zeno invoked, showing they weren't inherently contradictory within these modern mathematical frameworks.
Okay, so math seems to have resolved the paradoxes. But then, in a truly fascinating twist, Zeno's intuition seems to find a strange new life in, of all places, modern physics, specifically quantum mechanics. You mentioned the quantum Zeno effect.
Yes, it's a remarkable echo. First theorized by physicists Bijanath Mitra and George Sudarshan in 1977, and then experimentally confirmed by Wayne Atano and colleagues in 1989, this effect describes how the natural evolution of an unstable quantum system can actually be halted or significantly slowed down, essentially frozen, simply by observing it frequently.
That sounds incredibly strange, freezing something just by looking at it. How does that work? It sounds almost literally like Zeno's arrow paradox.
The analogy is definitely striking, which is why it got the name. Here's the basic idea. An unstable quantum particle, like a radioactive atom, has a certain probability of decaying over time. Its quantum state evolves towards the decayed state. However, according to quantum mechanics, the act of measurement collapses the wave function, forcing the system into a definite state, either decayed or undecayed. If you measure the system repeatedly and very frequently, each measurement effectively asks, "Have you decayed yet?" If the answer is no, the measurement collapses the wave function back to the initial undecayed state, resetting the decay clock, so to speak. If these observations are frequent enough faster than the natural timescale of the decay process, the system is continuously reset to its undecayed state and is effectively prevented from ever making the transition. It's kept pinned in its initial state by the observations.
So if you keep looking at it, it can't change. A system cannot change while you are watching it. It's aptly named after Zeno's arrow paradox, as it almost literally captures his intuition. The arrow is motionless at every instant it is observed. The very act of observing or measuring the quantum system can freeze its state.
It's as if Zeno's relentless snapshots of the arrow's flight, which he used to argue for its stillness, now find this bizarre echo in the quantum realm, where frequent observation actually causes a kind of stillness, preventing change.
Now, obviously, this isn't a direct confirmation of Zeno's ancient metaphysics, right? It doesn't mean motion is really an illusion in our everyday world.
Oh, absolutely not. It's a specific quantum mechanical effect with its own complex explanations. But it's a remarkable demonstration of the enduring power and perhaps the deep intuition underlying Zeno's core idea about observation and stillness. It shows how his ancient puzzles continue to resonate and find unexpected new life in the most advanced areas of modern science.
That's astonishing. Zeno, a pre-Socratic philosopher, somehow echoing in quantum mechanics. It really speaks to the depth and persistence of his original questions. But even with calculus, set theory, and these strange quantum effects, Zeno's paradoxes are far from settled in philosophy, are they?
No, not at all. The debate continues. The core philosophical question remains, does a purely mathematical solution, like calculus showing infinite series can converge, truly resolve the underlying metaphysical problem Zeno raised?
What's the worry there? If the math works, doesn't that solve it?
For some philosophers, not necessarily. Just because a mathematical model can coherently describe motion by summing an infinite series, that doesn't, for them, eliminate the conceptual or perhaps even physical difficulty of an object actually performing an infinite number of distinct physical actions, or traversing an infinite number of distinct spatial points in a finite time.
Ah, so there might be a gap between our mathematical descriptions and physical reality itself.
Exactly. Does the map perfectly capture the territory in this case? Zeno may have been the first to really expose this fundamental tension between our abstract, potentially infinite conceptual schemes and the concrete, finite world we seem to experience. And that tension continues to be a fertile ground for philosophical inquiry.
And a direct modern descendant of the Dichotomy and Achilles paradoxes that keeps this debate alive is the problem of supertasks, right?
Yes, the concept of supertask flows directly from Zeno.
So for our listeners who might be encountering this, what exactly is a supertask and what's the problem with them?
A supertask is formally defined as a task consisting of a countably infinite sequence of distinct, logically ordered steps that are completed in a finite amount of total time. Zeno's runner crossing infinitely many halfway points is a classic example. The core philosophical question is, are such tasks logically coherent, let alone physically possible?
Can you give an example that really makes you pause and think?
A famous one which revived Zeno's intuition in the 20th century comes from philosophers like Max Black and James F. Thomson. That's often called Thomson's lamp.
Thomson's lamp, how does that work?
Imagine a special lamp with a switch. You switch it on for 12 a second, then you switch it off for 14 of a second, then on again for 18 of a second, then off for 116 of a second, and so on.
So the intervals are getting shorter and shorter, forming that convergent series, plus 14, plus 18, plus...
Exactly. The entire infinite sequence of switching actions is completed in exactly 1 second, because that series sums to 1. Now the question is, at the precise moment 1 second has elapsed, is the lamp on or off?
Let me think. It completes an infinite number of switches. For every on state, there's a later off state. And for every off state, there's a later on state. It seems like.
It can't be either.
That's the problem. There seems to be no logical way to determine the final state. It can't be on because you never switched it on without later switching it off. It can't be off because you never switched it off without later switching it on. The question seems to have no coherent answer, suggesting that the very setup, the completion of an actual infinity of distinct operations in finite time, might be logically impossible, or at least conceptually problematic.
Wow, that really does short-circuit the brain, as you said earlier. It brings Zeno's challenge right into the modern era. This debate about supertasks is still active today.
Very much so. Philosophers continue to explore the logical and metaphysical status of supertasks, debating whether scenarios like Thomson's lamp demonstrate a genuine logical impossibility or just a failure of our intuition. It shows Zeno's core challenge is far from a settled historical curiosity. And finally, thinking about Zeno's paradoxes overall. The dichotomy, Achilles, arrow, stadium, they present this powerful, unresolved dilemma about the fundamental structure of space and time itself, don't they?
They absolutely do. Taken as a whole, they force us to confront a fundamental choice. Is reality at its most basic level continuous and smooth, infinitely divisible like the real number line in mathematics? Or is it discrete and pixelated, composed of fundamental, indivisible units, perhaps something like the Planck length and Planck time, that emerge as possibilities in quantum gravity theories?
And Zeno seems to have arguments against both options.
That's the brilliance. If space-time is continuous, we run into the dichotomy and Achilles paradoxes, needing sophisticated tools like calculus and measure theory to handle the traversal of infinities. But if space-time is discrete, then Zeno's arrow and stadium paradoxes become potent again, raising difficult questions about how motion can even occur smoothly, or how relative motion works in what is fundamentally a jerky, quantized world. How do things get from one pixel to the next?
So, this question, continuous versus discrete reality, which Zeno forced into the open, remains right at the forefront of theoretical physics today.
It absolutely does. The quest for a theory of quantum gravity is, in many ways, grappling with this very question about the ultimate nature of space-time at the smallest scales. Is it smooth or chunky? Zeno, remarkably, framed this fundamental dilemma 2,500 years ago.
The fact that he constructed arguments against both possibilities really underscores the incredible depth and foresight of his original insight. He essentially laid out the fundamental conceptual choices, the basic menu options for describing the fabric of reality.
And physics and philosophy are still working through those options. It's why his work endures. He didn't just offer clever problems. He framed the fundamental questions about the nature of the cosmos itself.
So wrapping this up, Zeno of Elea's place in the AI history of Western philosophy isn't secured by any grand doctrine he established or any positive system he built that we still adhere to.
No, his legacy isn't in building, but but perhaps in challenging the foundations others tried to build on.
Instead, his place is cemented by the revolutionary logical method he created, or at least perfected, and the profound, enduring problems he unleashed upon philosophical and scientific inquiry.
His primary achievement was arguably the invention and mastery of dialectic, particularly the art of rigorous, critical argumentation through reductio ad absurdum. In his zealous defense of Parmenidean monism, he introduced a standard of logical precision and relentless critical analysis that was arguably unknown before and became foundational for subsequent Western thought.
And his explicit project to prove that the common sense world of plurality and motion is a logical impossibility was, as we've discussed throughout, a brilliant failure.
A failure in the sense that he didn't persuade the world to abandon the evidence of its senses and embrace a static, singular reality. That just didn't happen.
But in failing at this specific, perhaps impossible task, he succeeded in something far more significant and lasting.
Absolutely. He exposed latent contradictions and deep conceptual difficulties lurking within our most basic, unexamined assumptions about space, time, infinity, division, and the continuum. His paradoxes are not mere sophisms, not just clever verbal tricks to be dismissed. They are powerful analytical tools that reveal the hidden complexities beneath the surface of the ordinary. They force us to think much harder, much more carefully about concepts we usually just take for granted.
Zeno's legacy, then, is a powerful testament to the generative power of negative critique, of asking hard questions. His challenges spurred Aristotle to develop key components of his own hugely influential physical and metaphysical system.
They lay dormant, in a sense, for centuries, understood mainly through Aristotle's lens, until the mathematical revolutions of the 19th century developed concepts powerful enough to resolve them mathematically, a process that, ironically, underscored the very profundity of the original problems by showing how much conceptual machinery was needed to tackle them.
And today, as we've seen, they continue to resonate in the most advanced frontiers of thought, from ongoing philosophical debates about the nature of supertasks and the continuum, to the strange realities of quantum mechanics and the quest to understand the fundamental fabric of space-time.
Zeno of Elea thus stands as this perennial provocateur. He is the quintessential philosophical gadfly, perhaps even more so than Socrates in some ways, whose deeply uncomfortable questions forced Western thought onto a more rigorous, more self-critical, and ultimately more fruitful path.
By demonstrating with stunning ingenuity that what seems most obvious can often be the most problematic, he ensured that his intellectual challenges would remain as potent and unsettling today as they surely were in ancient Elea.
It leaves you wondering.
Exactly. So as you, our listener, go about your day, maybe moving from one place to another, consider this. What other obvious aspects of your reality, if examined with Zeno's relentless, uncompromising logic, might also unravel into surprising contradictions?
What fundamental assumptions about the world, about yourself, about knowledge, do you hold that, if really pushed, could turn out to be the next great paradox, just waiting to be discovered?